The words, "I've been aching down there," weren't meant to be spoken out loud. Not in a dusty church, not on a wedding night, and certainly not by a bride to a man she barely knew. But Anna Blake had reached her limit of silence, of pride, of pretending she wasn't broken inside. Luke Tanner stood there, shirt half unbuttoned, the lamplight flickering against the hollows of his face. The same hands that could shuffle cards smoother than river water now hung helpless at his sides. He'd seen danger. He'd stared down death, but he'd never faced something like this. A woman's quiet confession that carried more pain than any bullet wound. It had been 1 week since the bet. 1 week since Thessaloon erupted in laughter at his expense. 1 week since he'd said, "Edo," to a woman whose voice he hadn't even heard before that moment. A gambler marrying a store clerk wasn't the kind of story folks forgot quickly in a place like Cedar Ridge, New Mexico territory, 1883. Luke thought marriage would be the punishment Big Tom Morrison promised. It'd be a cage dressed up as commitment. But each day that passed, the cage felt less like iron and more like something else, something he didn't yet understand. Anna Blake wasn't what he expected. She was quiet, yes, but not shy. Her silence was deliberate, the kind that carried weight. She moved through their little adobe house on Cottonwood Lane like she'd lived there forever, tidying, mending, cooking, never asking for help, and never complaining. She didn't nag, didn't whine, didn't weep until tonight. The storm had passed, the roof repaired, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine. Luke had just banked the fire when he heard her voice. Low, trembling, breaking. "I've been aching down there." The words froze him in place. He turned slowly, unsure if he'd heard right. Anna stood by the window, her hair unpinned, falling over her shoulders like dark silk. She wasn't looking at him. Her hands were clenched in front of her, knuckles white, shoulders shaking. I didn't speak, didn't move, just listened. "I thought it would stop," she whispered. "After the storm, after everything, but it hasn't. It hurts when I stand too long, when I work at the store, even when I breathe sometimes." Her voice cracked then, and Luke felt something inside him crack too. He took a step closer, slow and careful as if approaching a wounded animal. "Anna," he said quietly, "you hurt yourself during the storm?" She shook her head. "No, this started before, weeks before. I didn't tell anyone. Not Papa, not even the doctor when he stopped by. I was ashamed." Luke frowned, trying to understand. Ashamed for what? She turned then, finally meeting his eyes. In her gaze he saw pain, yes, but also a strange defiant strength. Because it's not the kind of hurt people talk about. Not the kind men like you want to hear about. It's the kind that makes a woman feel broken, unwanted. Her words hit like a bullet to the chest. Luke had expected this marriage to test his pride, maybe even his patience, but not his heart. He'd never had to comfort anyone before, never wanted to. He'd lived his life, avoiding other people's pain because his own had always been heavy enough. Now here was this woman, his wife, by a drunken bed standing barefoot in his house, bearing a truth so raw it made him ache too. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and stopped a foot away from her. "Anna, look at me," she did. "You ain't broken," he said firmly, "not to me, not to anyone." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "You don't even know me." Luke's jaw tightened. "Maybe not yet, but I know what it's like to think you're too far gone to be fixed. I've lived most my life that way." They stood there, silent except for the sound of rain dripping from the eaves. Luke wanted to touch her, to offer comfort, but he didn't dare. The space between them felt sacred somehow, like if he moved wrong he'd ruin the fragile trust she was giving him. After a long moment she whispered, "I didn't mean to say it like that. I just needed someone to hear me." "I heard you," he said softly, every word. Anna nodded, wiping at her cheeks. Then she turned back to the window, the lamplight outlining her in gold. "Papa used to say, pain makes people humble. I think it just makes them lonely." Luke didn't answer. He couldn't because standing there watching her fight tears she didn't want him to see. He realized something terrifying. He didn't want her to be lonely anymore. That night, long after she went to bed, Luke sat at the table staring at his cards. The same deck that had ruined him and somehow led him here. He shuffled them absently the way a man does when he's thinking too hard. For once the cards didn't bring peace. They just reminded him of the bed, the laughter, the shame, and of Anna. The way she'd said those words, the way she'd looked at him, not for pity, not for rescue, but for understanding. Luke Tanner, gambler, drifter, man without roots, found himself wanting something he didn't have a name for. By the time the fire burned low, he'd made up his mind. Tomorrow he'd ride into town, not for whiskey, not for cards, but for medicine, for anything the doctor could give him to ease his wife's pain. Because maybe for the first time in his life, Luke Tanner cared about someone more than himself, and that terrified him more than losing any hand he'd ever played. Morning came to Cottonwood Lane with a hush that felt like a held breath. The storm had passed 2 nights ago, but its echo still lived in the creak of the porch boards and the smell of damp earth. Luke Tanner saddled his horse before the sun was up. The horizon, a thin red line over the desert. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Anna standing there in the lamplight, fragile, hurting, too proud to ask for help. Her words had played over and over in his mind until they didn't sound like words anymore, but a plea. "I've been aching down there." He didn't know what it meant exactly, only that no woman said that unless something was deeply wrong. And Luke, for all his rough edges, wasn't the kind of man to ignore suffering. Not anymore, not hers. The doctor's office sat on the far end of Main Street, wedged between the barber and the undertaker. Luke dismounted, tied his horse, and pushed open the door. The smell of liniment and old wood filled the air. Dr. Halpern looked up from his desk, spectacles sliding down his nose. "Look, Tatter," he said, surprised. "You don't usually come in here unless you've been shot or cheated." Luke managed a thin smile. "Neither, thank God. This ain't about me." The doctor studied him. "Your wife?" Luke nodded. "She's not well. I don't know what's wrong exactly, but she's been in pain. Says it's been going on a while." Halpern's expression softened. "Most men wouldn't come here for that sort of thing. You're doing right by her." Luke shifted uncomfortably. "Just tell me what I can do." The doctor packed a small box of medicines and powders, explaining each one slowly. "Have her rest. Keep her warm. This land's hard on women, Mr. Tanner. Harder than it ever is on us." Luke paid him double and rode home with the box tucked under his arm. He didn't care what the town thought. Let them gossip. He'd lost his pride the night he'd lost that card game. Now he had something worth far more to protect. When he walked into the house, Anna was sitting at the table mending one of his shirts. She looked up, startled. "You went out early," she said quietly.
"Had to see the doctor." Her hands froze mid-stitch. "For what?"
"For you." He set the box on Thedable. "He gave me this. Said it should help." Anna's eyes filled instantly, but she didn't speak. Her fingers trembled as she touched the box, tracing its edges. "I didn't ask you to do this," she whispered. "I know. Then why?" Luke pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "Because you needed someone to care enough, and I reckon it's about time someone did." The words hung between them like dust in sunlight. Then Anna looked down, her voice shaking. "Nobody's ever done that before." "Not Papa, not anyone." Luke swallowed hard. Then they were fools. For the rest of the morning, Hess stayed close, chopping wood, fixing a loose shutter, finding reasons to be nearby without crowding her. Anna moved slower than usual, her body tired. But there was something lighter in her face, as if simply being heard had eased a burden no medicine could. When noon came, Luke made her sit and eat the stew he'd managed not to burn. She tried to protest, but he only crossed his arms and said, "You'll hurt my feelings if you don't." That made her laugh, a small sound soft and real. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh. By evening, she was stronger. They sat outside under the cottonwood tree, the sky painted gold and lavender. The silence between them felt easy now, not empty but full. "I used to think pain was punishment," Anna said after a while. "That maybe I was meant to be invisible. That it was safer that way." Luke turned toward her. "You ain't invisible now." "No," she meant his eyes. "Because you saw me." The air shifted then. Quiet, intimate, full of something fragile and new. Luke wanted to reach out to touch her hand, but she looked away first. "I'm sorry for how I spoke last night," she murmured. "It wasn't proper." "Proper don't matter much out here," Luke said gently. "Only truth does. And you told me the truth." Anna smiled faintly, eyes still on the horizon. "Do you always listen this?" "Well, only when the right person's talking." Her cheeks flushed and she stood brushing dust from her skirt. "You're a dangerous man, Luke Tanner." He smiled slow and easy. "Not half as dangerous as you think." That night, as the moon rose high and silver over the desert, Luke lay awake, listening to the creak of the old house, the soft rhythm of her footsteps in the next room. For the first time since the wedding, he didn't feel trapped. He felt alive. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew this. He'd risk every card, every coin, every ounce of pride he had left to keep that light in Anna Blake Tanner's eyes. The summer sun rose hard over Cottonwood Lane, burning away the cool of night before breakfast was done. The desert was wide awake, locusts buzzing, the cottonwood leaves shimmering like coins in a breeze that promised heat. Luke Tanner leaned on the porch rail, a tin mug of coffee in his hand, watching Anna move through the morning light. She was hanging the wash, sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hair braided loose down her back. The soft wind caught it now and then, lifting strands like threads of sunlight. Every movement she made was quiet, efficient, steady, but something in her was different now. She carried herself taller, her steps lighter, her eyes more live. The medicine had helped, yes, but it was more than that. She'd started smiling again, laughing sometimes. The itch that had hollowed her out seemed to have loosened its grip. Luke wasn't sure what to do with the way that made him feel. He'd gone through his life guarding his heart like a vault. Every loss, every betrayal teaching him to keep the door locked tight. But Anna Blake Tanner, the woman he'd married on a stupid dare, had found a way in without even trying. When she looked at him now, he felt it. That quiet pull that made him want to be better than he was. "Something on your mind?" she asked, catching him watching. He smirked, pretending to sip his coffee. "Just wondering how I ended up married to the hardest working woman in New Mexico." Anna grinned, shaking out a sheet. "Luck, I suppose." Quote, "Funny, I used to think luck was on my side." She gave him a sideways glance. "Maybe it still is, just not the kind you can spend." Luke chuckled, but the sound faded quick. There was something he'd been needing to say, and it had been growing heavier by the day. "Anna," he said quietly, "about that night, what you told me." She stilled, her hands on the wash line. "You don't ever have Toby ashamed for telling me the truth," he continued. "Not about pain, not about anything. You've got no reason to carry that alone." Anna turned, the sunlight catching the edge of her face. "And you? Do you carry anything alone, Luke?" He blinked. "What do you mean?" She came closer, her eyes searching his face. "You listen well, but you don't talk much about yourself. Not really. You've told me about cards and whiskey and running, but not what you're running from." Luke looked down at his hands, rough and scarred from years of work and sin. "I ran from everything that felt like home," he said after a long moment. "Because home meant losing something again. My father drank himself to death after my mother passed. After that, I figured it was better to stay unrooted. A man without ties can't be hurt." Anna's voice was soft. "But a man without ties can't be loved either." He looked up. "You saying that from experience?" She smiled faintly. "Maybe." They stood in silence, the kind that didn't need filling. The cottonwood rustled overhead, the sound like the sea he'd never seen. Finally, Luke reached out and took her hand. It was small and warm and fit against his palm as if it had always belonged there. "I don't know what kind of man I am, Anna, but I'd like to learn how to be the kind you deserve." She squeezed his hand. "Then start by staying. That's all I ever needed from anyone." He nodded once, solemn and sure. "Then I'll stay." Days turned to weeks, and life on the ranch found a rhythm. Luke worked the land, fixing fences, tending the small garden they planted behind the house. Anna managed the home and helped her father at the store. They shared meals, laughter, and quiet evenings on the porch, watching sunsets that turned the world to fire. It wasn't perfect. There were still silences, still unspoken fears, but there was peace. Then one afternoon, word came from town. Red Jack and his men had been spotted near the ridge, the same drifters Anna had faced down weeks before. The sheriff warned they might be looking for payback. Luke's jaws set hard. "They won't come here," he told Anna, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. "They might," she said calmly, loading the rifle he taught her to use. "And if they do, we'll be ready." That night, Luke barely slept. Every creak of the porch made him reach for his gun, but dawn came quiet, too quiet. It was near noon when he heard the distant rumble of hooves. 3 riders' silhouettes against the heat shimmer. "Stay inside," Luke said. "No." Anna stood in the doorway, steady, her gray eyes cold still steel. "Not this time." The riders stopped 20 yards out, dust swirling around them. Red Jack grinned, teeth flashing beneath his sunburned face. "Heard the gambler found himself a wife. Thought we'd come congratulate you proper." Luke's voice was calm but low. "Turn around and ride out. This is your only warning." Red Jack laughed. "I ain't scared of you, Tanner. You might be fast with cards, but I'm faster with lead." Anna stepped forward then, the rifle steady in her hands. "You'll be faster to the grave if you tree." The men shifted uneasy. Everyone in town knew about the quiet bride who could shoot straight. Red Jack spat in the dirt. "You're lucky today, Tanner, but luck runs out." "Maybe," Luke said, "but mine just changed." He raised his gun not to shoot, but to remind them he meant every word. The 3 outlaws wheeled their horses and rode off into the dust. When silence settled again, Anna exhaled slowly, lowering the rifle. Her hands trembled only a little. Luke crossed to her, his heart pounding, and took her by the shoulders. "You shouldn't have come outside," he said, but his voice wasn't angry. It was full of awe. "I wasn't going to let you face them alone," she said. He stared at her, at the woman who had walked into his life as a punishment and become its purpose. Then he leaned in and kissed her, not out of obligation, not out of relief, but because it was the only thing left to do. It was a kiss that tasted like dust and fear and something close to forever. When they finally broke apart, she smiled up at him. "You think this marriage might actually work?" He chuckled. "It already has. Just didn't know the gamble I was winning." Weeks later, when the monsoon rains returned and the cottonwoods swayed green and heavy over their porch, Anna Tanner sat beside her husband, watching the horizon. The world was still wild, still dangerous, still untamed. But for the first time, Luke Tanner wasn't running from it. He was rooted in it, in the land, in the home they'd built, and in the woman who turned a bet into a love story worth keeping. And as the night deepened and thunder rolled across the desert, Anna reached for his hand, whispering, "Still think you're unlucky, Mr. Tanner." Hesmilled into the dark. "Not anymore, Mrs. Tanner, none anymore."